Hey guys, tonight we're diving nose first into the foulest corners of medieval life. And no, it's not plague pits or battlefield gore, it's worse. Because tonight, we're exploring how people in the Middle Ages stayed clean. Or more accurately, how they didn't. If you enjoy snoozing to the sound of historical suffering, I'd love it if you gave this a like or even subscribed. It really helps, unlike medieval soap. And I'm always curious where you're listening from, so drop a comment with your city and the time it is there. I love seeing our sleepy little global community connect. Now, settle in, dim the lights, maybe let a candle flicker nearby, and let's ease into tonight's journey, because you're about to discover why having foot fungus in medieval times was the least of your worries. You're hunched beside a shallow wooden trough in the corner of a dim, smoky room. A goat is staring at you. Somewhere, a child sneezes directly into a cooking pot. The water in the trough was last changed around the same time the moon eclipsed the sun, which, in medieval terms, means probably never. It's cloudy with something. You'd like to say soap residue, but your nose tells you it's closer to foot broth. You dip your fingers in anyway. Because this is the closest thing to a bath you're going to get this season. In the Middle Ages, full-body bathing was considered suspicious at best, sinful at worst. Many believed that hot water opened the pores, which sounded great, until you realised they thought that's how disease got in. So instead of washing, you masked body odour with herbs, ashes, or sometimes just prayer. Soap existed. It was usually made from animal fat, wood ash, and disappointment. The rich had access to imported Castile soap, which smelled faintly of olives and bankruptcy. The poor? They scrubbed with something that resembled gravel dipped in grease. Now if you think hand washing was better, good news, it was marginally less revolting. Emphasis on marginally. Communal basins were a thing, one for the whole household, which meant washing your hands in the same water your uncle just used to rinse his armpits. Delicious. Tooth care was equally ambitious. People used linen cloths, crushed herbs, or, if they were feeling fancy, a twig. There were no toothbrushes, there was no toothpaste, there were just expectations and clove oil. But hey, at least if your teeth fell out, you had fewer places for worms to hide. Hair care? Lice combs were common. So were lice. There were even medieval louse tournaments. Yes, people literally placed bets on whose comb would catch the biggest one. Imagine a cockfight, but with insects and no dignity. And don't even ask about toilet habits. Chamber pots were used at night and dumped into the street by morning, sometimes with a courteous yell of "Gardy-loo," which is medieval for duck or suffer. You glance down at your own feet. You haven't taken your shoes off in weeks. That's normal. Socks are for nobles and the overly optimistic. You peel back your tunic sleeve to scratch a rash that may or may not be sentient. The scab peels off in a satisfying yet concerning way. You pretend not to notice. You try not to breathe through your nose. You try not to sit directly on the wooden bench, which is splintered and suspiciously damp. You also try not to panic at the buzzing in your ear. It's either a fly or something worse, possibly both. And still, somehow everyone's acting like this is perfectly normal, because it was. Hygiene in the Middle Ages wasn't just a struggle. It was a team sport played with lowered expectations and very few winners. Most people never knew what it meant to feel clean. They just aimed for less dirty than yesterday and hoped no one noticed the mushrooms growing in their undergarments. And speaking of undergarments, you might want to take a deep breath before we head into the next part of your day. Because if you think the daily scrub was bad, wait until you see how medieval folks handle their laundry. Spoiler, it involved rivers, rocks, and a high chance of frostbite. You are standing knee-deep in a slow-moving river. It is not summer, it is barely spring. Your hands have gone a colour that most skin should not. Every rock is slippery and threatening, and the cloth you're holding is more alive than dead. This is laundry, medieval edition. You take a deep breath and slap the linen against the rocks like it personally offended you. Which, to be fair, it did. It has been absorbing your body's most questionable decisions for weeks, possibly months, possibly generations. No one is keeping track anymore, and now comes the soap, or rather, the thing pretending to be soap. You dip your hand into a greasy leather pouch and pull out a lump of ash-lace lard. It smells like a candle that went through something traumatic. You smear it across the fabric and pretend it helps. Here's the fact. Medieval laundry wasn't a weekly chore. It was a seasonal act of desperation. Most peasants owned one or maybe two sets of clothes, which meant that if you were washing something, you were either very bold or very naked. Possibly both. Instead of scrubbing everything yourself, you might just boil your clothes in a giant cauldron of water, mixed with wood ash and fermented urine. Yes, urine. Human urine. It contained ammonia, which helped break down oils and stains. Which sounds scientific until you remember you're now standing in your own pea stew, watching your socks dissolve into a sad soup. And no, it wasn't just the peasants. Even castles are designated laundry areas. They were called fulling rooms, and they smelled exactly how you'd imagine a room filled with steaming human filth might smell. Fullers were the unsung heroes of medieval hygiene, except no one actually called them heroes. They were just weirdly damp all the time. Drying your laundry was another adventure. There were no dryers, no spinning racks, just hope, wind, and the faint possibility that a goat wouldn't eat your undergarments while they hung over a bush. More than a few medieval arguments began with the phrase, "I think that's my loincloth in your hedge." Now let's talk about fabric. Linen was common among peasants. It was cheap, durable, and absorbent, which made it perfect for everything from tunics to personal hygiene. People used strips of linen for wiping after using the privy. The same linen that later went into laundry. The same linen that might now be pressed against your face as a scarf. Wool was warm but tricky. Wet wool has the comforting texture of a swamp and holds smells like a grudge. Washing wool required cold water and gentle care, which means most people just didn't. They wore it until it stopped resembling clothing and started resembling a sentient moss blanket. Upper classes had servants for all this, but even noble garments weren't safe. Brightly dyed robes bled colour, fancy fabrics frayed easily, and perfume only masked so much. Imagine spending a fortune to smell like rose water and regret. You glance around the river. You're not alone. Other villagers are here too, each one furiously beating their clothing against rocks like it owes them money. A woman nearby is yelling at a fish. A man is rinsing something that definitely should not be rinsed in shared water. A child is holding a sock and asking if it's food. You want to leave, but you know what's coming next, the rewear. Because no matter how hard you scrubbed, no matter how long you soaked, once that fabric dried and you put it back on, it was like embracing a damp apology. The itch returned, the scent lingered, and the lice, well, they never really left. In fact, many people baked their clothes in ovens or hung them over fires to kill the lice. Not wash them, just slow roast the bugs into oblivion. It was less about cleanliness and more about pest management with a side of potential arson. There were even superstitions around laundry. Washing clothes during religious holidays was considered disrespectful. Washing on certain moon phases could bring bad luck. And hanging your undergarments too close to the church was grounds for gossip and possible spiritual condemnation. You wring out your tunic. The water drips down your arms like warm apologies. Your fingers are shriveled. Your dignity is somewhere downstream. And yet, somehow, you feel accomplished. Briefly. Until you realise that in 2 weeks you'll be doing this all over again. Possibly with more urine. The wind picks up and your half-dried shirt is now airborne. You chase it across the mud like a wounded duck. People stare. A chicken joins the pursuit. You wonder if this is how your ancestors envisioned glory. But if you think Laundry Day was a nightmare, just wait until you get a good whiff of what passed for public bathing in medieval towns. Because next, we're stepping into the steam house, and you're going to wish you hadn't. You chase your damp shirt down the riverbank and narrowly rescue it from a goose with questionable motives. But before you can bask in your victory, you're pulled toward another medieval ritual. This one involves heat, steam, and a concerning number of strangers. Welcome to the bathhouse. You're now standing in a low wooden building that smells like wet wood, boiled onions, and something that might once have been mint. Maybe. There is steam rising from a central pool. Voices echo through the fog. Bare feet slap against stone. and someone is definitely doing something suspicious with a ladle. This is not a spa. This is a medieval stew of humanity. Bathhouses were surprisingly common in medieval towns. Especially in the earlier Middle Ages, public bathing was not only acceptable, but encouraged. People genuinely believed that washing was good for the body and soul, at least until the Black Death came along and everyone decided that opening your pores might let the plague crawl in. But before that panic set in, bathhouses were bustling. They were heated by large stoves and sometimes even built near natural hot springs if you were lucky. Most were gender segregated, though not always. Mixed bathing was debated. Church officials frowned on it. Locals, not so much. You step inside. The heat hits you like a wave of regret. There is a stone bench covered in towels, which sounds comforting until you realise that towels, in this case, are reused strips of linen that have seen things no fabric should see. You sit anyway, because this is the only warmth you've felt in weeks. A large cauldron of water is boiling nearby, not for tea, for mixing. Cold water is added to the tub from buckets, occasionally with herbs or floral oils if someone wealthy is visiting. But most of the time, it's just water. The herbal sachet floating next to you is more decorative than functional. And by decorative you mean mouldy. And yes, you are sharing this water. You're shoulder to shoulder with people who have not bathed since the last lunar eclipse. Someone sneezes. Another person coughs and spits into a bucket that then gets rinsed into the bath. You pretend you didn't see it. Here's where the facts get steamy. Bathing was often a communal activity. You were expected to come here to get clean, socialise, maybe even negotiate business deals. Some bathhouses doubled as taverns or inns. You could order wine, you could get food, you could catch up on gossip, you could also catch lice, or worse. Because bathhouses were not sterile, they were not filtered, there were no chlorine tablets, no lifeguards, just bacteria, ambition, and the occasional eel in the plumbing if the water source came from the wrong kind of river. Bathhouse workers, known as balneaters, had the unenviable job of stoking fires, hauling water, and occasionally scrubbing down the more questionable guests. They were part therapist, part janitor, and part medieval risk manager. They were paid in coin, tips, or sometimes just silence. The floors were slippery, the steam was blinding, and the bath water was often reused multiple times before being changed. Some bathhouses had different pools for different purposes: hot bath, cold bath, foot bath, mystery bath. You did not want to be in the last one. Toilet facilities were optional. If a bathhouse had a latrine, it was likely a hole in the ground near the corner. If it did not, then things got creative. You're now eyeing every corner of the room very suspiciously. And then, of course, there was the other business. Many bathhouses moonlighted as brothels. Not officially, but often enough that they gained reputations. In German-speaking regions, they were sometimes called Badstube, which translates loosely to bathing rooms, but in certain towns may as well have meant scandal boxes. City officials frequently tried to regulate the practice, which usually meant issuing a law, forgetting about it, and hoping no one asked too many questions. You lean back against the warm stone. A beetle crawls past your foot. You're not alarmed, you're just resigned. This is your life now. Towels were scarce. So after bathing, most people air-dried or wiped off with whatever fabric they brought. Clothes went back on over damp skin. Hair was left to dry in the breeze. And if it was winter, you either stood by a fire or accepted that frostbite was the price of freshness. Soap was available for bathhouse use but often cost extra. You could bring your own, or rent some. Yes, rent soap. A shared communal block that had been in more hands and more crevices than you care to imagine. It was sometimes attached to a string so it didn't float away, or so it didn't float too far. Despite all this, medieval people were genuinely trying to stay clean, especially before big events, holy days, weddings, feasts. Some towns even had free bath days provided by local guilds or benefactors. It was seen as a civic duty, a gift to the community and to the communal nose. You're now exiting the bathhouse, slightly cleaner, considerably more confused. The The air outside is cold, but at least it doesn't smell like steamed ankles. You inhale, you cough, you pretend it's refreshing, but you cannot stay idle. Because as much as people tried to clean themselves, their houses were a different story entirely. And now it is time to step inside a medieval home and discover why even the rats sometimes preferred the alley. You step out of the bathhouse feeling like a boiled turnip with slightly less grime than before. Your skin is pink, your feet are pruned, and your lungs are full of other people's steam, but at least you are technically clean. Now all you need to do is go home, which sounds comforting, until you open the door. Because the moment you step inside your medieval home, you're hit by an aroma that defies explanation. It is not one smell, it is a collaboration, a full ensemble of earthy, fermented, and possibly cursed fragrances. You're breathing in a choir of rot. Welcome to your domestic nightmare. You're now standing in the centre of what would generously be called the main room. It is also the kitchen, the bedroom, the nursery, and the guest wing. The walls are made of wattle and daub, which is a charming way of saying sticks stuffed with mud. Sometimes straw, sometimes manure, whatever filled the gaps. There is no insulation, there are no windows. There is, however, a smoke hole in the roof. You look up. It is mostly decorative. The floor is not a floor, it is dirt, packed down by centuries of feet and fluids, occasionally swept with a broom made of twigs tied together with hope. There is no tile, no wood, just earth. Some families scattered straw across it. Others used rushes, which sounds rustic until you realise the rushes were rarely changed and collected everything. Crumbs, hair, animal droppings, human droppings. More than one scholar described it as a soft compost pile with furniture. There is a fire burning in the centre of the room. It is the only source of heat. The smoke curls up and sideways and occasionally into your eyes. There is no chimney, just the slow suffocation of everyone inside. Medieval lungs were not lungs. They were charcoal filters with complaints. Now let us talk about what lives with you. Because it is not just your family. There are mice in the walls, rats in the straw, fleas in your bedding, and the occasional chicken walking casually across the table. In some homes, pigs slept indoors to keep them from being stolen. Imagine snuggling next to a grunting pork volcano during the night. Imagine stepping in its gift first thing in the morning. The bedding situation is also inspirational, by medieval standards. You share a mattress made of hay, wool, or feathers if you're rich. The poor use straw in sacks, sometimes just a pile of old clothes. Sheets are optional. Changing them is a rare and festive occasion, like a medieval birthday, but with less joy. The mattress itself is never cleaned. It absorbs everything. Sweat, lice, secrets. It is a sponge of sorrow. And when it begins to smell, which is always, people sprinkle herbs on it. Lavender, rosemary, mugwort. Not because it removed the smell, but because it layered it. Now you get mildew and mint. The chamber pot situation is equally noble. Everyone uses one. It lives under the bed, or beside the fire, or on the floor if you're particularly chaotic. You do your business in it and toss it out the front door, sometimes out the window. With luck, you shout a warning first. With even more luck, someone listens. Now look at the walls. They are not clean. They are stained with smoke, scratched by animals, smeared by children. Spiders live in the beams. Cobwebs are not removed. They are encouraged because they catch flies. And in medieval logic, anything that eats something worse is a friend. The roof may be thatched, which means it is made of dried plant stalks, insulating, charming, and alive. Thatch attracts insects, mice, birds, occasionally snakes. If you're lucky, none of them fall on you while you sleep. But this is not a world built on luck. In many homes, the kitchen is the corner of the room with the fewest flammable things. A pot hangs over the fire. Meat hangs from a hook, if you're lucky enough to own meat. Otherwise it is porridge, or soup, or something pretending to be soup but is actually just hot disappointment. The water bucket sits near the door. You fill it from the village well, unless you have a stream nearby, which is also where the animals drink, and people wash, and sometimes relieve themselves. It is the most popular broth in town. Bathing at home is rare. There is no tub. You use a basin, a bucket, a wet rag, or just stand in the rain and apologise to the sky. Children might be rinsed in cooking pots. Adults wipe down with linen cloths soaked in vinegar or urine. Again with the urine, it was the medieval version of bleach, and the medieval version of every terrible smell. Pests are a fact of life. You pick lice from your hair, you squish fleas on your thighs, you swat flies with your hat, which is made of wool, which holds its own ecosystem of mites. There are no exterminators. There is just suffering. Some people sleep with herbs stuffed in their pillows to ward off vermin. Others give up and call the infestation a roommate. Even churches smelled bad. The holy water fonts grew algae. The incense masked sweat. The pews were soaked in human effort, and the relics in the reliquaries. Not always as clean as advertised. You sit on a stool. The stool wobbles. Everything wobbles. Because everything is handmade from green wood and desperation. The table leans. The spoons are greasy. The air feels thick. You're sweating again. And you just bathed. You wonder how people ever invited guests into their homes. But they did. And guests came. And they ate. And they praised the cooking while trying not to breathe too deeply. This was not filth by medieval standards. This was cosy. You close your eyes and breathe through your mouth, which is worse. You open them again, but you cannot stay here long, because the worst part of the medieval hygiene system is not the house itself. It is what happens when you leave it, because now it is time to step into the street and see what passed for urban sanitation when horses were the dominant transportation and human waste management involved gravity and denial. You shove the door open with your elbow because your hands are full of soiled linens and regret. The moment it creaks open, your senses are assaulted by something far worse than your home. You step outside and realise the truth. The streets are somehow worse than everything inside. You're now ankle deep in a medieval sanitation system that is neither sanitary nor much of a system. The ground beneath your feet is not cobblestone, not even dirt. It is a layered soup of slop, hay, animal waste, and discarded intentions. It squelches when you move. You do not ask what the squelch is made of, because you already know. Most medieval streets had one thing in common. No drainage, no gutters, no pavement. Just a slight slope in the middle that allowed all the filth to slide vaguely toward the centre. This was called the kennel, not to be confused with a dog kennel, though the smell was similar. The kennel was the open trench in the middle of the road where waste of every variety collected. Rainwater, food scraps, urine, feces, blood, animal remains, broken tools, bones, soup, teeth, and occasionally a human finger if the tavern brawls got out of hand. And the best part, it all stayed there, until someone came along with a rake and pushed it somewhere else, usually a little further down the road, sometimes into another neighbourhood, occasionally into a rival's doorstep. You take a few cautious steps. You're trying to find a dry spot. There are none. You're trying not to slip. You already have. Your shoe is now something else entirely. The medieval belief in miasma was at its peak during much of this period. People thought disease came from bad smells, which was technically not wrong, but the solution was not cleaning the streets. It was burning herbs, carrying flowers, or placing sweet-smelling plants in your hat and pretending that lavender would protect you from the soup beneath your feet. You pass a butcher's stall. Blood drips directly onto the street. The head of a pig lies on the ground, staring at you with an expression that says you're next. Flies cover everything. So do children. They play in the mud like it is a playground. It is not mud. Horses clomp past. They leave behind steaming gifts. No one cleans them up. You just walk around them, if you are lucky. If you are unlucky, you walk through them and then track it back into your home. Full circle. Chamber pots are emptied out of windows. This is not a joke. This is daily life. You hear a yell above you, a warning cry. Something like, "Guardy-loo." It means watch out, or look out below, or hope you're not directly under it. You look up, you move, just in time. The pot's contents splatter next to your foot. You do not react. You cannot react. If you react to every splash, You will never make it through town. You keep walking. The market stalls are pressed together with no regard for spacing. Fish rots on tables beside slabs of unrefrigerated meat. Cheese sweats under burlap. Eels writhe in barrels. None of this is covered. None of this is protected. Flies are part of the scenery. So are rats. Rats in the Middle Ages were not pests. They were citizens. They lived in homes, in walls, in clothing. They ran across roofs and stole from bread baskets. Cats tried to fight them. Dogs barked at them. But rats always won. You see one now. It is dragging something unidentifiable across the street. You do not interfere. Sanitation laws existed. Cities like London and Paris actually had regulations against tossing waste into the street. But they were rarely enforced, mostly because there was no one to enforce them. Also because everyone was doing it, including the people writing the laws. Some towns had designated dung collectors, the nightmen, the gong farmers. They were paid to shovel human waste from pits and carry it outside city walls. They worked at night. Because the stench was unbearable during the day, and because no one wanted to see their faces and remember what they did. It was a profession of necessity, and a one-way ticket to social invisibility. You pass a dead dog. It has been there for some time. It is not being removed. It is simply returning to the earth, naturally, with assistance from maggots. You do not make eye contact. Rain is now falling. You think this will help. You're wrong. It activates everything. It turns the street into a slurry. The smell rises. The waste spreads. Your shoes are now part of the street. You keep walking. Public toilets exist in theory. In reality, they are few and often terrifying. Some hang precariously over rivers. Others are just open pits behind buildings. The brave use them. The rest use whatever corner offers the most privacy, which is not much. And then there are the cesspits, hidden beneath homes or behind buildings, brick-lined holes that collected waste over months, sometimes years. They were rarely cleaned. When they overflowed, they became someone else's problem, sometimes literally. In 1326, a man in London fell into one and drowned. This was not considered unusual. It was considered Thursday. You pass a tavern. The smell of beer fights the stench of the street. It loses. The door swings open. A man stumbles out and vomits onto the ground. No one flinches. You step around it. Barely. And yet, despite all this, people still wore shoes with long pointed toes, called poulaines, completely impractical for this terrain, but fashionable. Some were so long they had to be tied to the knees with string. They dragged through the filth like noble worms. They were the crux of their day. Just with more plague, you're now standing in the town square, the centre of civic life. It smells like boiling cabbage and despair. A horse has just relieved itself next to a man selling pastries. The man continues selling. The horse walks away. The pastries remain. You want to sit down. You do not. There is nowhere clean. There is no clean. There is only relative filth. You lean against a wall. You regret it instantly. The wall is damp. The wall is always damp. And just when you think it cannot get worse, a trumpet sounds. Not for celebration, for punishment. Because public executions often took place right here, and they were messy. Very messy. The kind of messy that sticks around. But before that spectacle begins, you decide to move on. Because now it is time to go somewhere truly medieval. Somewhere private, somewhere quiet, somewhere where all the hygiene horrors of the era come together in one dark, poorly ventilated and horrifying little room. Because next you're stepping into a medieval toilet, and you are not ready. You take one final breath of the open air which smells like boiled meat and shoe rot, and step into what medieval people referred to, without irony, as a necessary room. You are now entering the toilet, though it goes by many names: privy, guardrobe, jakes, latrine. But make no mistake, this is not a place of privacy or comfort. This is a vertical tube of despair. You close the creaking wooden door behind you. The latch is a piece of string. The floor groans beneath your weight. There is a wooden bench with a hole in it. Below the hole is mystery. And within that mystery is fear. You sit. slowly, carefully, and immediately regret every decision that brought you here. Toilets in the Middle Ages were not designed for sanitation. They were designed for gravity. Waste dropped straight down into pits, or moats, or the river, or sometimes onto the street if the architecture was particularly bold. There was no flushing, no water system, just the hope that what went down would stay down. Castle toilets were often built into the outer walls, a vertical shaft lined with stone, sometimes ending in a cesspit. These were called garderobes, from the French words for guard and robe. Why? Because people stored their clothing in them, not as punishment, but because the ammonia from the fumes killed lice. The smell was not a flaw, it was a feature. You're now beginning to sweat, not from heat, but from the proximity to what lies beneath you. Cesspits were rarely emptied. When they were, it was by gong farmers, who dug out the hardened waste and hauled it away in carts. This job paid well, mostly because it had a 100% smell retention rate. Gong farmers were not allowed to live in town centres. They worked at night. They were both necessary and never invited to dinner. If a cesspit was not emptied regularly, it would overflow, upward, into the home, into the courtyard, into the collective memory of everyone involved. In 1183, the King of Scotland's cousin died when the floor of a castle latrine collapsed beneath him. He fell into the pit and was never seen again. This was not a fable. This was recorded history. You shift on the bench. The wood creaks ominously. The hole beneath you feels alive. Now let us talk about wiping. Toilet paper did not exist, not even in theory. People used what they had: rags, hay, moss, straw, leaves, the corner of a tunic if things got desperate. In wealthier households, soft wool or linen cloths were used and then washed. In less wealthy households, the concept of soft did not exist. In monasteries, monks used turgors, strips of cloth or sponges on sticks that were rinsed and reused, sometimes stored in jars of salt water, sometimes not stored at all. You do not want to know where they were stored instead. Bidets were not a thing. Washing happened later, if at all. You might rinse your hands in a basin, or not. Many toilets did not include hand-washing facilities, because the prevailing belief was that visible dirt was the only kind worth removing. Public toilets were worse, much worse. In some cities, public latrines hung over rivers. In others, they were communal pits behind taverns. You used them in full view of your peers. You tried not to make eye contact. There were no partitions, no stools. Just a bench and a line of people pretending this was normal. And then there were night stools, kept beside the bed for midnight emergencies. They were small wooden boxes with a hole in the top and a removable bucket inside. You sat in the dark. You hoped for accuracy. You emptied it in the morning, or later, or whenever the smell became sentient. You glanced down. Something is moving in the hole beneath you. You tell yourself it is the wind. It is not the wind. Flies buzz in the corners. You swat one and miss. The ceiling is low. The air is thick. The window is not a window. It is a slit in the wall that may or may not be plugged with straw. The smell is overpowering. It clings to your skin like shame. You try not to imagine the build-up below. You fail. You think of centuries of waste, the sheer volume, the chemical reactions, the squelching. In some places, people lit fires beneath latrines to combat the smell. This worked briefly, until someone lit too large a fire and the methane gas exploded. That was not an accident. That was chemistry. It happened more than once. There were attempts at improvement. Some monasteries used running water to flush waste away. Some castles built elaborate drainage systems, but most homes relied on buckets, gravity, and a strong stomach. Toilets were so feared that people avoided them after dark. There were legends of demons in the privy, spirits that pulled you down, rats that climbed up, snakes that lurked in the darkness. You scoff, and then you hear something splash and you stand quickly. You do not wipe, you do not linger. You flee the chamber like it insulted your mother. You breathe once you're outside, which is a mistake, because while the toilet is behind you, the consequences are not. because next you're about to learn what passed for deodorant in the Middle Ages, and spoiler, it was not deodorant. You do not stop running until the toilet is out of sight and your lungs are filled with the comforting scent of open sewage and overripe onions. But even that is a step up from what you were just marinating in. You slow your breathing, you wipe your hands on your tunic, you pause, and then it hits you. The smell is not coming from the toilet anymore, it is coming from you. You lift your arm and recoil. Your armpit smells like salted meat left too close to a fireplace. Your neck smells like wet wool. Your feet have declared themselves an independent kingdom. You're now fully aware of what people in the Middle Ages tried their hardest to pretend they could not smell. Because body odour was not a problem. It was simply part of being alive. People in the medieval period did not expect to smell pleasant. They expected to smell like work, and work smelled like sweat, dirt, garlic, animals, wool, wood smoke, and whatever was growing inside your socks. This was not an embarrassment. This was identity. Perfume was a luxury, soap was rare, but sweat was democratic. Everyone had it, and everyone dealt with it in their own special way, which mostly meant not dealing with it at all. You shift your shirt and feel the fabric clinging to your skin like guilt. It is damp, not from water, from existence. Let us begin with underarms. Deodorant did not exist. Antiperspirants were centuries away. Some people applied crushed herbs or scented powders to mask their scent. Rosemary, sage, mint, myrrh, sandalwood if you were wealthy. But these were not used for daily hygiene. They were used for special occasions like weddings, court appearances, or surviving plagues. Some people sewed herbal sachets into their clothing. These were not just fashion, they were olfactory self-defense. Think of them as medieval air fresheners worn around the neck or tucked into sleeves. A medieval man might walk into a room smelling like lavender and leave smelling like a goat. The church encouraged cleanliness, but only spiritually. Physical filth was tolerated. In fact, it was sometimes celebrated. Certain saints were praised for never bathing. St. Agnes was said to have gone her entire life without washing. St. Thomas Becket once wore a hair shirt so pungent that when he was assassinated, the knights nearly passed out. His holiness was measured in stink. You lift your collar and give it a sniff. It smells like wool that's been buried under a compost pile. Your skin itches. Your scalp tingles. You scratch. You regret it. Hair was another battlefield. Washing it was uncommon. Oily scalps were the norm. People combed their hair frequently, not to clean it, but to remove lice and nits. Combs were made from bone, wood, or horn, and yes, they were often shared. Which means you were trading lice with your neighbour like Pokemon cards. To mask head odour, some people rubbed scented oils or powders into their hair. Others braided it tightly to hide the grease. Hats and hoods also helped. But mostly by trapping the scent closer to your brain. Feet were a whole other story. Shoes were made from leather, cloth or wood. Socks were rare. The lucky had woolen hose. The unlucky had skin problems. Sweat soaked into footwear and stayed there for weeks. If you ever wondered why people burn their shoes, now you know. Mouth odour was handled with even less grace. Toothpaste did not exist. People chewed herbs like parsley, fennel or anise. Sometimes cloves. Not for dental health, for breath camouflage. You were not cleaning your teeth. You were staging a perfume-based distraction. You pass someone on the street. You smell them before you see them. Their breath is a blend of onions and ambition. Their shirt smells like it was boiled in cabbage water and forgotten in a barn. They smile. You smile back. You are now part of the system. In noble households, scented gloves and handkerchiefs were fashionable. Not because nobles were cleaner, but because they had more to hide. You might see a baron with rose-scented palms and a back that smells like salted goat. Duality was the standard. Some people believed bad smells could protect you. If disease came through the air, then your personal miasma was your first line of defense. There are accounts of people refusing to wash because they thought cleanliness would weaken them. Their stench was considered armour. You duck into a bakery for warmth. The scent of bread soothes your soul until you realise that the baker has not washed in days and is sweating directly into the dough. The bread smells amazing. The baker does not. public events were particularly aromatic. Feasts, fairs, Massachusetts. Imagine hundreds of unwashed bodies pressed into one stone building on a summer afternoon. No windows, no air circulation, just centuries of tradition and 140 collective armpits waging olfactory warfare. You step back outside. A breeze hits your face. It carries the faintest hint of something pleasant. Chamomile, jasmine. Someone nearby is burning incense, not for ceremony, for survival. And still, somehow, romance persisted. People fell in love, kissed, courted, married, despite everything, despite the breath, despite the feet, despite the invisible fog of decay that hovered around each body like a cursed aura. You take one final sniff of your sleeve and swear revenge on every bar of soap you ever took for granted. But before you can even dream of bathing again, your eyes lock on a sight more concerning. A barber's pole, red and white, spinning in the breeze, calling you toward a building where hygiene and horror merged in one ancient profession. Because next you're stepping into the world of medieval barbers. And these were not just haircutters, these were surgeons, these were tooth pullers, these were bloodletters, these were men who sharpened knives for a living and aimed them at your face. And they almost never wash their hands. You approach the pole cautiously. It is red and white, spiraled like candy. But there is no candy here, only blades and bruises, and a faint metallic smell that clings to the wooden door like a warning. You push it open, you're now inside a barber's shop, and you will not leave the same. The room is small and humid. The walls are bare. The floor is sticky. There is a wooden chair in the centre. Its armrests are carved with grooves from centuries of gripping hands. A basin sits beside it, stained red. Not with paint, not with wine, but with experience. Because medieval barbers did not just cut hair, they cut skin, they cut bone, they cut just about anything they were asked to cut, and they did it with the same tools, the same knives, the same razors, the same hands. You sit. The barber approaches. He wears an apron that might once have been white. He carries a leather pouch filled with razors, hooks, scissors, and saws. The pouch jingles when he walks, like a music box that only plays screaming. He asks what you need. You say a trim. He hears bloodletting. Because in the Middle Ages, barbers were also surgeons. Not formally, not academically, but practically. Monks were forbidden from shedding blood. So the job of healing fell to men with knives and questionable morals. They became known as barber surgeons, and their work was legendary. They pulled teeth, they lanced boils, they cut abscesses, they stitched wounds, they shaved heads for lice, they drained pus, they set bones, they opened veins to let the bad humours out, and they rarely washed their tools. You glance at the basin again. It is filled with lukewarm water and something floating that used to be organic. The towel beside it is damp. The scissors glint in the candlelight. Barbers believed in balance. The balance of the four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile. If you were sick, it meant one of these was too strong. So the barber would open a vein and let it pour. Sometimes a little, sometimes a lot, sometimes until you saw your ancestors. The iconic barber pole represents this process. The red symbolises blood. The white symbolises bandages. The pole itself represents the stick patients squeeze to make their veins bulge. You're now staring at that pole with a newfound appreciation for modern medicine. Haircuts were offered too, of course, but shaving was risky. Razors were not sterile, skin was not clean. Barbers often shaved beards and lanced cysts in the same session, with the same blade. You now understand why facial scars were so common. Barbers also offered enemas, cupping, tooth extractions, wart removal, all done with medieval precision, which is to say, none at all. You watch as the barber sharpens a blade on a leather strop. The sound is soft, rhythmic, comforting, until you remember what he is preparing for. He approaches. He does not wear gloves. No one does. Germ theory is 5 centuries away. Hygiene is a matter of wiping the blade on your sleeve and hoping for the best. You flinch as the razor touches your cheek. He begins to scrape, carefully, expertly, until someone walks in holding their jaw and moaning. The barber nods, sets down the razor, picks up a pair of iron pliers. You're not dismissed. You're not asked to move. You're now watching dentistry. The man sits beside you, opens his mouth. The barber inserts the pliers and yanks. There is a crack, a scream, a spurt of blood. The barber wipes the tool on his apron, sets it down, picks up your razor, and returns to your face. You reconsider every decision you've ever made. Many barbers kept jars of extracted teeth on display, like trophies, like warnings. They also kept leeches for bloodletting, stored in ceramic pots and fed with pork. If you were lucky, they used a fresh one. If not, you shared with the last patient. Prices varied. A shave cost a coin, a bloodletting cost 2. Surgery was negotiable. If you died, your family got a discount. You glance around the shop. The shelves are lined with oils, powders and dried herbs. Not for healing, for masking the smell. There are no medical charts, no books, just stains. Many, many stains. Despite the chaos, barber surgeons were respected. Feared, but respected. They filled a vital role, especially in rural areas where doctors were rare and monks were busy praying not to get involved. In fact, barbers often travelled, set up mobile tents at fairs and festivals, offering tooth extractions between puppet shows. You could win a chicken, eat a pie, and lose a molar in one afternoon. You stand, the shave is done, your face is smooth, your neck is nicked, you're not bleeding badly, which is a medieval success. You exit the shop with a slight tremor and a deep appreciation for sterile technique. You look back once. The barber waves. Behind him, a man screams. You walk on, but your journey into medieval grooming is not over, because you are about to enter a world of plucking, scraping and eyebrow disasters. Because next you're about to learn the disturbing truth about medieval skincare, and why your complexion was not just a personal matter, it was political. You barely make it a block before your freshly shaved skin begins to burn. Not metaphorically, literally. Your face is reacting to centuries of bacteria, metal filings, and the faint residue of someone else's bloodletting. You resist the urge to scratch, which only makes it worse. You need relief. You need healing. You need skincare. You're about to regret that decision, because medieval skincare was not gentle. It was medicinal violence with a splash of wishful thinking. You duck into a side alley and enter what might be a healer's hut or a cosmetics shack, or possibly just someone's kitchen that smells like sulphur and rosemary. The shelves are lined with jars, pots, vials, and bundles of herbs suspended from the rafters like a witch's chandelier. You do not ask questions. You just point to your face and wince. The woman nods. She hands you a bowl of something that looks like porridge but smells like pickled eggs and burnt leather. You're told to apply it generously and wait for the magic. You do. The burning intensifies, because what you have just smeared across your skin is a mixture of lead, vinegar, crushed bones and rose petals. It is meant to cleanse your pores, and maybe your soul, but mostly it is going to irritate every follicle on your face until it gives up and dies. Welcome to medieval dermatology. Beauty standards in the Middle Ages were clear. Pale skin was ideal. It meant wealth, nobility, the luxury of avoiding sunlight and disease. So people went to great lengths to lighten their faces. Some methods were simple. Stay indoors, wear veils, powder your skin with flour or chalk. Others were less simple, like rubbing lead white paste onto your face until your pores screamed. This cosmetic contained cerus, a substance made from vinegar and lead shavings, left to ferment in clay pots. It made your skin smooth and radiant, and also poisoned you slowly. You examine your reflection in a basin. Your skin is blotchy. Your eyes are watering. You're halfway to beautiful and fully on your way to tetanus. To remove blemishes, medieval people used concoctions made from mercury, arsenic, and vinegar-soaked bread. Acne was not considered a skin condition. It was considered a moral failure or divine punishment. You did not go to a dermatologist, you went to confession. If you had boils, the treatment was fire, hot irons, cauterization, or ointments made from lard, soot, and pig's bile. These were applied directly to the inflamed area, often by someone with no medical training and very strong hands. For those with dry skin, the solution was animal fat, goose grease, bear fat, sweat. You smeared it on your cheeks like a winter coat. The smell lingered. The dogs followed you home. You touch your face again. You're no longer sure where your skin ends and the salve begins. Something is tingling, possibly healing, possibly plotting. Eyebrow fashion was another battlefield. Thin, arched brows were popular, but instead of tweezers, people used fish bones, or hot wires, or plucked them out one by one with their fingernails while reciting prayers. Some shaved them entirely and redrew them with soot. Others dyed them using walnut shells or crushed bugs. Foreheads were expected to be high, so high that women sometimes plucked their hairlines to appear more noble. This practice was called frontal baldness, and it was considered elegant. You pluck one hair from your brow and instantly regret your entire lineage. Face masks were common. Clay, egg whites, honey, ground almonds, even bird droppings. Pigeon feces was believed to brighten the skin. Mixed with vinegar, it made a popular face wash. It also made you smell like a terrified coop. To treat sunburns, people applied cow dung, onion juice, or boiled lettuce water. To reduce redness, they used crushed pearl or chalk dust. To remove freckles, they applied lemon juice and waited for the stinging to remind them of their choices. Scars were permanent, but if you wanted to hide them, you could paste your face with flour, animal glue, and powdered horn. This dried into a crust that flaked off like the social life of anyone wearing it. Lip care was rare. Chapped lips were considered natural, but if you wanted colour, you could apply beet juice, cochineal dye, or the blood of a recently squeezed leech. Nothing said romance like the faint hint of parasite. You notice that your face has stopped tingling. It has now gone numb. The healer is rubbing a block of something that might be salt across your forehead. You do not stop her. You have surrendered. You're now fully exfoliated and slightly cursed. Before you leave, she offers you a small jar for the road. It is labelled in Latin. You cannot read Latin. You nod. You take it. It smells like pickles and sadness. You step back into the street and let the sun hit your face. You instantly feel your pores retreat. But you are not done. Because medieval hygiene was not just about appearances, it was about rituals, and one of the most important rituals involved things that crawled, chewed, and burrowed. Because next you're going to learn how medieval people fought lice, fleas, and everything else living in their bedsheets, and you are not going to like it. You're walking with a jar of questionable cream in one hand, and a growing rash across your jaw when something itches behind your ear. You scratch. The itch moves. You scratch again. The sensation multiplies. You stop walking. You reach up and pull something from your scalp. It wriggles. You do not scream. You simply stare into the tiny face of your new reality. You have lice. You probably also have fleas. You may even have a few bedbugs hitching a ride in your sleeve. You're now officially inhabited. And in the Middle Ages, so was everyone else. Lice were not an anomaly. They were a feature. People expected them. Children named them. Adults crushed them between their fingernails like bubble wrap. Fleas were a daily nuisance. Bedbugs were as common as pillows. And rats were just neighbours with better teeth. You try not to panic. You tell yourself this is normal, and unfortunately it is. Medieval pest control was less about eradication, and more about managing expectations. There were no insecticides, no bug sprays, no peppermint oil diffusers. There were combs, fire, smoke, vinegar, shouting, and prayer. You duck into a nearby building. It is a common house. The air is warm. The straw bedding is lumpy. You're told to sit. You're told to remove your outer garment. You're told this will only sting if you're weak. The lice comb is brought out. It is made of bone. Its teeth are fine. Its purpose is singular. To drag tiny creatures from your scalp one by one. The process is slow, intimate, personal. You're being groomed like a sheep. You try to relax. You fail. Lice combing was a daily activity in many households. Mothers combed their children, wives combed their husbands, servants combed their employers. There were even public lice combing sessions, a social gathering, a bonding experience, a shared nightmare. You watch as your own lice are squished against a cloth. The cloth is stained. So is your pride. For fleas, the approach was different. People wore flea traps. These were small pouches filled with sweet herbs or animal fat wrapped in linen. Fleas were drawn to the scent and crawled inside, where they were then crushed. It was like medieval roach motels, but on your chest. Some households lined their beds with wormwood or tansy to repel insects. Others burned rosemary in the hearth. The smoke choked everyone equally, but confused the fleas long enough for people to sleep. Your itching spreads to your arms. You're offered a vinegar rub-down. You accept. The vinegar is cold. It burns slightly. It also attracts flies. You're now a salad. Bedbugs were another matter entirely. They lived in the straw mattresses, in the walls, in the beams, in the seams of your clothing. They fed at night and vanished by morning. You rarely saw them. You always felt them. To fight them, some people hung their bedding outside during the day. Others roasted their mattresses near the fire. This worked, until the mattress caught fire. Then you just had fewer bugs and also fewer belongings. In some regions, people slept with onions or garlic tucked under their bedding, not to repel pests, to mask the smell of their bites. It was less about comfort and more about psychological warfare. You lean back. A small child next to you is picking lice from his sister's hair. She giggles. He shows you a fat one and offers it to you like a trophy. You decline. Politely. Rodents were their own category. Mice in the thatch, rats in the pantry. People set traps, poisoned them with powdered glass, released cats and hoped for the best. But mostly, they just learned to live around them. It was common to wake up and find that a rat had nibbled your toe in the night. You bandaged it. You moved on. Monks shaved their heads not for fashion but for lice control. The tonsure made it easier to clean. It also made it easier for lice to find their favourite spots. The irony was not lost on anyone. Cleanliness helped, in theory. But as you already know, cleanliness was more of an aspiration than a standard, so the pests persisted, and people adapted. In wealthier homes, beds were sometimes draped with canopies, not for beauty but for defence. The curtains could be tucked in to trap the bugs inside, or trap them outside. Depending on who won the nightly battle, some people sewed netting into their sleeves and collars, flea collars, but for humans. Others simply rubbed their skin with lard and ashes, making themselves too slippery to bite. It worked about as well as you would expect. You're now coated in vinegar, itching from phantom bugs, and watching a man across the room hold up a sock and ask if it is food or clothing. You are unsure. You leave. Outside, you feel the breeze. It is a temporary relief, but you know the itching will return, because lice do not respect fresh air, fleas do not fear daylight, and bedbugs have better attendance than most bishops. You walk on. But the deeper issue of cleanliness is still unresolved, because even if you scrub yourself raw, even if you burn your sheets, even if you vinegar baste your armpits, you're still stuck with one inescapable truth. You live in an age where soap is made by boiling fat and lye together in a cauldron while praying it does not explode. And that is exactly where you are headed next. Because now it is time to learn how soap was actually made in the Middle Ages, and why using it sometimes made things worse. You are itchy. You're sour. You're crusted with the residue of vinegar, insects, and regret. And now, in your moment of desperation, you're told the solution is soap. Real soap. Not ashes. Not prayer. Not sage bundles taped to your chest. But something in a solid block that is allegedly capable of removing filth. You are sceptical. And then you are taken to the place where soap is born. A place that smells like burnt marrow and betrayal. You're now standing inside a medieval soap maker's workshop. The floor is sticky. The ceiling is black with soot. There are large iron cauldrons bubbling away like witches forgot to label them. The heat is oppressive. The scent is worse. You're breathing in equal parts animal fat, wood ash, smoke, and something you will never identify. Because medieval soap was not gentle, it was not refreshing, it was not cucumber melon scented, it was a chemical mistake made on purpose. Soap, as it turns out, is the byproduct of a violent chemical reaction called saponification. You take fat, you take lye, you heat them together and stir until your arms give out. Then you pour the results into a mould, let it harden, slice it into bars and try not to cry from the fumes. The fat came from animals. Boiled down tallow scraped from cattle, pigs, sheep, whatever was available. The smell was thick, greasy, clingy. If you ever wondered what despair would feel like if it were spreadable, this was it. The lye came from ashes, specifically wood ashes soaked in water until the liquid leached out. This fluid was incredibly alkaline. It burned skin, it stripped oil, it dissolved anything soft. You're now beginning to understand the issue. Soap in this period was less like modern body wash, and more like a medieval exfoliating brick of chemical violence. If it did not burn a little, it was considered weak. If it burned a lot, it was considered working. You watch the soap maker pour fat into the cauldron with a grunt. He adds lye and stirs with a stick that has seen things. The mixture fizzes and pops. You're told this is normal. You're not convinced. Different regions had different recipes. Aleppo soap from the Middle East used olive oil and laurel berry oil. Mild, creamy, expensive. Castile soap from Spain used olive oil only. More refined, highly valued. But across most of Europe the standard was fat plus fire plus pray it does not explode. Scented soap was rare, a luxury for the wealthy. If you were lucky, someone tossed in some lavender or mint. If you were unlucky, the soap still smelled like boiled hooves. Soap makers were not glamorous. Their workshops were banned from city centres due to the smell. They worked on the outskirts, near the tanners, near the butchers, near the places where noses went to die. The soap hardened into greyish blocks that looked like masonry and felt like regret. You were advised to use them sparingly, not because they were precious, because they could flay you open if used improperly. You're handed a bar. It is warm, slightly soft, oozing at the corners. You touch it and immediately feel a tingling sensation that might be cleansing or corrosive. Washing involved scrubbing this block against your skin while pouring cold water over yourself, sometimes with a rag, sometimes with your hands, sometimes with a friend if privacy was not an option. Soap was also used for laundry. The same bar, same ingredients, same bucket. Your clothes were treated to the same treatment as your armpits. This made them clean. It also made them stiff, discoloured, and occasionally edible to goats. You now understand why some people just did not use soap. They preferred ashes, or sand, or coarse cloth. Anything that did not smell like death and leave chemical burns. And yet soap had its place. It was used by apothecaries, by barbers, by midwives, even by monks when the weather was warm enough. It was traded across cities, hoarded during wars, occasionally mistaken for cheese. You sniff the bar again. A mistake. It smells like scorched pig and wet fireplace. You're told this is the good batch. Some wealthier homes imported perfumed soap from the Islamic world, where soap making was centuries ahead. These bars were milder, rounder, wrapped in silk. They were prized possessions, sometimes gifted, sometimes stolen. You do not have perfumed soap. You have what appears to be a weaponized potato. You apply it to your skin, slowly. It does lather, slightly. It also takes the top layer of your dermis with it. You rinse with cold water. The burn is immediate. The smell is improved, slightly. You feel clean and raw and vaguely insulted. Soap was not used every day. It was too precious, too intense. Most people bathed with water alone and reserved soap for special occasions, like weddings or executions or pest outbreaks. You dry your skin with a cloth that was once part of someone's curtain. You're smooth, you're slippery, you're lightly wounded, and yet you feel accomplished. You feel like you have survived something, until you're handed a second bar. This one is labelled toilet soap. You ask what it is for. You're told it is for intimate areas. You drop it immediately. But your ordeal is not over, because just as you begin to recover your dignity, you are reminded of the next great medieval hygiene mystery. How exactly did people in the Middle Ages trim their nails without scissors? Because next you are about to learn why fingers and toes in medieval Europe were often covered, curled, and possibly crawling with secrets. You glance down at your hands and realise you've made a mistake. Your fingernails, once vaguely respectable, now resemble the edge of a burnt parchment. There is dirt under every nail, possibly animal fat, possibly soup, possibly both. Your thumbnail is split. Your pinky has a mystery stain. Your cuticles have formed a union and are currently revolting. And this is still better than your feet. You curl your toes inside your shoes and try to ignore the damp, gritty sensation that has become your normal. You tell yourself you can fix this, that someone, somewhere, knows how to help. And then you remember where you are, because in the Middle Ages nail care was an afterthought at best and a moral hazard at worst. Medieval people had fingernails, they used them, they broke them, they chewed them, but they did not have nail clippers, they did not have cuticle oil, they did not soak their fingers in warm milk and rose water. They scraped, tore and bit until the problem was solved or infected. You now understand the danger. You find a bench and sit, slowly, carefully. You examine your hands. They are calloused, filthy, covered in small nicks. You look like you've just lost a fight with a hedgehog. And still, this was standard, expected, even admired. Because soft hands meant you did not work. Clean fingernails meant you were vain. Polished nails meant you were suspiciously wealthy or in league with the devil. The goal was not beauty. The goal was function, and the occasional lack of tetanus. Let us begin with the tools. There were no nail clippers, not in the form we know. If you were rich, you might have a manicure knife, a small curved blade used for trimming nails and cutting hangnails. If you were poor, you had your teeth, or a sharp rock, or hope. Some people carried small grooming kits, metal instruments for scraping, cutting and cleaning under the nails. These were often attached to belts, right next to your eating knife, because nothing says hygiene like scraping manure from your thumb and then slicing cheese with the same blade. The problem was not just length, it was content. Fingernails collected everything. Ash, soot, breadcrumbs, lice eggs, the occasional flea. Dirt was expected. But too much dirt was a sign of negligence. Not enough dirt was suspicious. You had to strike the perfect balance between I work and I'm not diseased. You reach for a twig and try to clean under your nails. It splinters. You regret everything. Toenails were another ordeal. Medieval shoes were tight, pointed, uncomfortable. They pushed the toes together. Nails grew into corners, got infected, turned black, came off, grew back crooked, and still no one stopped wearing those shoes. The wealthy used foot baths, hot water, herbs, stones for scrubbing. The poor used rivers, or nothing. Toenails were often ignored until they curled, cracked, or threatened a rebellion. There are written records of people describing feet so crusted and overgrown that their nails resembled claws. These were not metaphors, these were observations. Paring your nails was sometimes associated with vanity, and vanity was dangerous. The church frowned on excessive grooming. It was believed that cleanliness of the body could distract from cleanliness of the soul. Long nails were linked to pride. Painted nails were foreign and suspicious, especially if you were a woman. Some monks were required to keep their nails short as a sign of humility. This was enforced by inspection. Yes, there were monks whose job it was to check everyone's fingers. That was their life. In certain villages, trimming nails on Sundays was forbidden. Doing so on holy days was considered bad luck. In some regions, people believed that burning your nail clippings would prevent witches from using them to curse you. Others buried them in the garden, or tossed them into the fire, or fed them to pigs. You're now looking at your nails very differently. There is even evidence that nail clippings were used in folk medicine, ground into powders, mixed with herbs, swallowed, rubbed on wounds, placed under pillows to ward off evil. You suddenly feel the urge to never touch anything again. As for nail polish, there was none. Though some Eastern cultures developed colourants from henna and other botanicals, medieval Europe stuck to a more natural aesthetic, meaning dirty and cracked. You try biting your thumbnail, it resists. You pull, it snaps. You are now bleeding slightly. Congratulations, you have joined the medieval elite. There is a man across the square sharpening a knife on a stone. You approach. He asks if you want it sharp or very sharp. You hold up your hands. He nods. You're not the first. The trim is fast, brutal, effective. Your fingernails are now uneven, jagged, and shorter than you intended, but they are trimmed, mostly. You do not thank him. You give him a coin and a look that says you will never speak of this again. But now that your nails are managed, you begin to notice something else. A faint, greasy feeling. A slickness on your scalp. A sudden awareness that your hair, once hidden by a hood, has begun its own journey into chaos. Because next you're going to learn the truth about medieval hair washing, and it involves eggs, lard, ashes, and decisions no one should ever have to make. Your fingernails are trimmed. Your cuticles are less angry. Your dignity is recovering in small doses. But just as you begin to feel human again, a gust of wind lifts your hood and sends your hair flapping into your face. And now you smell it. Your hair has taken on a scent that can only be described as ancient soup left near a forge. You run your fingers through it. They do not make it out. The strands are greasy, clumped, textured like candle wax and straw glue. There is something stuck behind your ear. You pretend it is not alive. You need to wash your hair. You poor fool. Because in the Middle Ages, washing your hair was a culinary experiment with emotional consequences. You ask around. A woman points you toward the village bath. Another offers you an egg. A third tells you to wait until the moon is waxing, lest your soul escape through the scalp. You ignore her. You follow the egg. Medieval shampoo as a concept did not exist. Hair washing was rare, irregular, and dangerous if done too often. People believed water weakened the brain, that wetting the head too frequently would soften the skull, that hair, once stripped of its natural oils, would fall out in protest. So the process was not about deep cleansing. It was about cosmetic illusion, making the hair appear cleaner, or smell less like a rotting barn pelt. You enter the bathhouse again. You're directed to a corner where the hair washing supplies are stored. There is no shampoo, no conditioner, no scalp brush. There is a bowl, a jug of cold water, a rag, a cracked comb, and a basket of raw eggs. You're told to begin. First, the hair is doused with water, cold, always cold. Hot water is for kings and the very ill. You lean forward. The water is poured. It runs down your face, into your shirt. The scalp tightens. Your teeth rattle. You feel something dislodge from your roots and land in the basin with a splash. Then comes the cleansing agent. Some used egg yolks. Rich in fats and proteins, they added shine and softness. They also attracted every stray dog in a 2-mile radius. Others preferred ash water, made by boiling hardwood ashes, and using the resulting lye-rich liquid as a cleansing rinse. It stripped oils, and skin, and sometimes hope. You're handed both. The egg is cracked into your hands. It drips through your fingers like regret. You massage it into your scalp. It slides. It clumps. It cooks slightly on your overheated skin. The ash water follows. It burns. Slightly. Maybe more than slightly. You begin to smell like breakfast inside a blacksmith's apron. You're told this is good. You're told you're glowing. You're told to stop squinting like that. Some medieval texts suggest mixing rosemary or nettle infusions into the rinse to strengthen hair. Others recommend urine, aged for several days, then strained through cloth. This was believed to bleach hair, add body, and frighten away lice through sheer force of personality. You're not offered the urine, you're grateful. Rinsing comes next. More water, more splashing. Your eyes sting. The egg has congealed near your temple. Your scalp feels both clean and traumatized. You're given a towel. It is damp. Already used, possibly by a horse. You dry. Combing is next. You're handed a wooden comb with missing teeth. It snags immediately. You hear a sound like parchment tearing. A man nearby mutters something in Latin and offers you a smaller comb for detail work. You refuse. Haircuts were not fashion statements, they were life strategies. The poor often kept hair short out of necessity. The wealthy wore it long and oiled. Both groups shared combs and infestations. Hair oil was made from lard, beeswax or animal marrow mixed with herbs. It gave hair a glossy sheen and a texture comparable to oiled rope. It also encouraged flies to sit on your head like it was reserved seating. You're now handed a small tin of medieval hair wax. It smells like boiled goose and thyme. You apply it. You immediately regret it. Colouring hair was possible. Red hair could be intensified using henna or crushed madder root. Blonde hair was achieved through sun exposure and vinegar rinses. Black hair could be darkened with lead combs or soot rubbed into the roots. You're told your colour is muddy field at dusk. You accept this. Hair accessories were more hygienic than decorative. Braids helped reduce lice. Head coverings kept dust and soot out. In some cities, married women were required by law to cover their hair completely, not for modesty, for sanitation. You wrap your head in a linen cloth, it is tight, but it hides everything, and you are thankful. Because just as you begin to feel clean, you overhear someone muttering about beard lice, eyebrow mites, and a travelling monk who shaved half his head and found something still moving beneath it. You stand, you leave. But as you step outside, your stomach turns, not from nerves, from hunger. Because after all this scrubbing and scratching and egg smearing, you now face the final question of the medieval hygiene cycle. How do you clean your utensils? Because next you are going to learn what happened inside a medieval kitchen, and why your bowl was washed in the same water as someone's feet. You shuffle into the kitchen, stomach growling, scalp steaming faintly from the herbal omelette you just rubbed into your hair. The fire crackles in the hearth. A pot bubbles on the edge. Something is being chopped. Something else is screaming. You ignore it. You are handed a wooden bowl. It is warm, greasy, slick with residue that glistens in the firelight like candle wax and shame. There is something hardened on the edge. You try to scrape it off with your thumbnail and immediately regret it. Because this bowl has not been washed. Not really. Not completely. It has been wiped. And in the Middle Ages that was enough. You sit, you eat. The stew is salty and brown and tastes like 6 meals ago. It sticks to the wood like sap. You finish it anyway. You hand the bowl back, and now you see what washing dishes actually looks like. There is a bucket in the corner. Not a sink, not a basin. A bucket. It is filled with lukewarm grey water that smells like onion skins and foot trauma. Floating in it are 3 spoons, a cup, and what appears to be a very tired carrot. Someone dips your bowl into this mix, swirls it, pulls it out, wipes it with a rag. The rag is stiff, stained, possibly sentient. The bowl is now considered clean. You accept it. You stare at it. You wonder how any civilization made it past this point. Because dishwashing, in the medieval sense, was not about sanitation. It was about removal of visible chunks. If the item no longer had a hunk of meat clinging to it, it was ready for reuse. Grease, texture, bits of bread stuck to the rim. That was called flavour layering. There was no soap. Not for dishes. Not for daily use. Soap was precious. Reserved for laundering clothes or shaving livestock if things got fancy. Most dishes were cleaned with hot water, ash and scrubbing materials that range from moss to hay to handfuls of regret. In wealthier households, a servant might boil the dishes after large feasts. In poorer homes, dishes might be rinsed once a week, or just licked clean by the dog, or passed down the table until someone shrugged and ate from it anyway. You watch as someone drops a ladle onto the floor, they pick it up, blow on it, return it to the pot. You do not say anything. You simply begin to lower your standards like everyone else. Tableware was usually wood or pewter. Wooden bowls absorbed everything. They were porous. After a while, they developed grain rot, which caused the wood to split, smell, and slowly return to the earth. This was not seen as a problem. It was simply bowl aging. Metal bowls fared better, but pewter contained lead. Hot food caused the metal to leach, which meant your stew came with a side of nervous system damage. If you started forgetting things, people assumed it was spiritual, not chemical. Forks were rare, suspicious, considered effeminate or even blasphemous in some regions. After all, God gave you fingers. Why invent tiny pitchforks for cheese? Spoons were common, but personal. Most people carried their own, often on a string, like medieval keys. If you forgot your spoon, you borrowed one and tried not to think about who licked it last. Plates were shared, especially among the poor. A single trencher, usually made of stale bread or flat wood, served 2 people. You ate from your side. They ate from theirs. If one of you died mid-meal, the other simply continued. After the meal, the table was wiped with cloth, or not. Bones were tossed to the floor, crumbs swept into corners, dogs handled the rest. Sometimes pigs, sometimes children. The water used to clean dishes was often reused throughout the day, or multiple days, until it became a soup of soapless broth that smelled like defeat. If you wanted cleaner results, you might add salt or vinegar to the water. This helped. Slightly. But mostly gave the bowl a nice tang. Cups were wiped between users. Sometimes. If the previous person had open sores or visible drool, you might get a fresh one. Otherwise it was hand-me-down hydration. Water flasks were communal. Ale mugs were shared. Sanitation was a trust exercise with strangers. Knives were cleaned by licking them, or wiping them on your sleeve, or plunging them into a loaf of bread and calling it degreasing. You're now remembering every knife you have seen today with deep concern. Bread was often used as a plate. Called trenchers, these stale slabs soaked up juices and became soft. You could eat them after the meal, or feed them to animals, or if you were truly desperate, re-dry them and use them again. You're now holding your washed bowl again. It smells like soup from last week. You stare into the bottom and see a small piece of something. You poke it. It moves. You set it down gently. In noble homes, dishwashing was performed by kitchen boys. In peasant homes, it was a shared task, or avoided entirely. Some people ate directly from the pot to skip the cleaning altogether. Others used leaves, bark, or even flat stones as plates. These were considered disposable. You watch as someone dips your spoon into the same grey water from earlier. They dry it with the communal cloth. They hand it back. You place it in your belt. You are now part of the system. And just as you prepare to leave, you hear coughing from the corner. Someone is scrubbing a cast iron pot with sand. Another is licking a ladle. The cook sneezes into a bowl of lentils and stirs it casually. You step outside. You're full. You're unsettled. You're strangely sticky. But your journey is not over. Because if you really want to understand medieval hygiene, you need to look beyond dishes and dirt. You need to understand what people wore under their clothes. Because next you're going to learn the truth about medieval underwear, and why it was a combination of linen, superstition, and probably mould. You step away from the kitchen and feel the stew sloshing around somewhere between your stomach and your soul. Your fingers are still damp from dishwater that might have had cheese in it. You walk slowly, breathing through your mouth, attempting to regain composure. And then it happens. Your undergarments shift. Something rides up. Something folds strangely. Something damp that was not damp 5 minutes ago makes itself known. And now you realise the truth. You have entered the medieval age of linen-based betrayal. Because beneath the wool, the leather and the fur, every man, woman and child in medieval Europe wore underwear. Just not in any way you would call supportive, or breathable, or sanitary, or individually owned. Let us begin with the basics. You're wearing a linen shirt, a long one. It reaches your knees. This is your base layer, your armour against the outer filth. It is your undershirt, your nightshirt, and possibly your handkerchief if things get dire. It has not been washed recently, or ever. It smells like body heat and bad decisions. You have one, maybe 2. You rotate them based on crust levels. Beneath that, you're wearing brays. These are your underwear. Imagine a large linen diaper with a drawstring. Now imagine it slightly damp and bunched in all the wrong places. Congratulations. You're halfway to medieval comfort. Brays were baggy, often knee-length and tied at the waist. Some had leg loops, others did not. Some were slit for convenience. Others just required improvisation. If you needed to relieve yourself quickly, you untied the strings, prayed your tunic didn't dip into anything, and hoped for decent weather. Women wore a similar garment, though often longer and without the convenient access. Some simply went without, not for liberation, but for ventilation. Layers added warmth, but they also added moisture, and in a world without antibiotics, swamp crotch was a medical emergency. You shift uncomfortably, something is sticking to your thigh. You walk like a man balancing regrets. Now comes the question of laundering. Undergarments were made of linen. Linen was absorbent. It held sweat, oil, and every consequence of medieval nutrition. It stained easily, it dried slowly, and it was washed even less than everything else. Why? Because washing linen wore it down, scrubbing damaged the weave, soap was scarce, and boiling took time. So instead, people hung their underthings near the fire, or over a bush, or under the bed in the hope that ambient shame would neutralize bacteria. There are accounts of noblemen sharing underwear with their servants, as in literally handing down yesterday's pair to the boy polishing boots. It was not considered cruel, it was considered practical. Clothing was valuable, fabric was expensive, ownership was fluid. You now look down at your own garments. You wonder how many previous owners have left their mark. Fashion also played a part. Tighter outer garments in the later Middle Ages meant a tighter fit underneath. Brays became smaller, shorter, more clingy, and less forgiving. The result was visible lines, awkward shapes, and a general sense of doom with every bend. For women, the problem was worse. There were no bras, no structured support, just tight lacing and strategic layering, linen bands, woolen bindings, and an unspoken agreement not to jog. Corsetry came later, but early versions existed. Long strips of fabric tightly wrapped, designed to flatten everything. Comfort was sacrificed for silhouette. Movement was limited, breathing was optional, and beneath it all there was the sanitary cloth, or, more commonly, nothing. Menstruation was handled with linen rags, held in place by belts, or ties, or pure determination. These cloths were washed, dried, reused, or in some cases burned and replaced with moss or sheep's wool. There were no pads, no tampons, just chafing and prayer. You're now thinking about every outfit you've ever worn and sobbing internally. Undergarments were not sexy, they were not lacy, they were not scented, they were functional sacks of personal humidity, but they mattered. The state of one's underwear could be used to judge character. If your linens were white and crisp, you were clean. If they were grey and stiff, you were poor. If they were missing entirely, you were either rebellious or very, very hot. In some cities, laws were passed to regulate how much undergarment could be shown. Exposed linen was considered scandalous. A visible shirt hem was a flirtation. A visible braise waistband was grounds for whispers. And yet, people lived their lives in these garments. They farmed, they cooked, they fought wars, they danced, they suffered, all while marinating in layers of unwashed linen. You step behind a wagon and adjust yourself. A peasant woman nearby does the same. Neither of you makes eye contact. There is an understanding here. But now that your underwear is secured and your legs are vaguely dry, you begin to feel the weight of another need. You do not need to bathe, you need to smell better. Because next, you're going to learn how people in the Middle Ages tried to cover up the stench of life with perfumes, herbs, and desperation, and why walking past someone with a pouch of lavender was considered an act of public service. You take one cautious step and your undergarments squish faintly. Your scalp itches from residual egg yolk. Your spoon smells like onion stew and floor dust. But somehow, through sheer strength of denial, you begin to feel almost human. Until someone walks past you. They're cloaked in the scent of rosemary, vinegar, and something faintly peppery. You inhale instinctively. Your nose flares. Your eyes water slightly. It is not a pleasant smell, but it is intentional. You realize you have just encountered medieval perfume, or what passed for it. Because in a world where daily washing was suspicious, disease was airborne, and soap was a controlled substance, Scent became more than vanity. It became survival. You follow the person discreetly. They turn down a lane and disappear into a wooden stall draped in dried herbs, hanging bundles of lavender, jars of crushed petals, vials of thick oils sealed with wax, a small caged ferret that may or may not be part of the inventory. You enter. The smell is immediate, strong, complex, equal parts floral, animal, herbal, and fermented. It hits the back of your throat like a mouldy bouquet. This is not fragrance. This is strategy. You're now inside the olfactory armory of the Middle Ages. Medieval people did not use perfume the way we do now. There was no spritz and stroll, no top notes of citrus with undertones of seduction. Scents were worn like armour, to mask your own stench, to repel evil spirits, to block out the smell of everyone else. Start with the basics. The most common odour-masking method was the herb pouch. People carried small bags filled with dried lavender, rosemary, sage, and mint. These were worn around the neck, sewn into clothing, hung from belts, pressed against the nose in crowded markets. The more potent the mixture, the more tolerable your day. These pouches were called pomanders, from the French pomme d'ambre, meaning amber apple. Some were shaped like fruits, some were carved metal spheres, some were just socks with rosemary in them. You're handed one. It smells like time and desperation. Essential oils existed, though they were primitive, made by steeping herbs and flowers in fat or wine, then straining the result. Popular ingredients included rose, chamomile, musk, civet, and frankincense. Less popular ones included goose grease, burned myrrh, and fermented almond mash. You pick up a vial. It is labelled in Latin. You cannot read it. You open it anyway. It smells like spoiled honey inside a church. Do you put it down? Perfume was expensive, mostly reserved for the upper classes. Nobles bathed in rose water, sprinkled their clothes with orange blossom, burned perfumed wax in their chambers. Some even flavoured their gloves, so that when they waved you smelled wealth. The poor had other methods, like soaking rags in vinegar, wringing them out and wiping them across the body. This was called vinegar washing, and it was as much a scent as it was an exfoliating crime against skin. Others made pastes from flower petals and lard. You rubbed it into your hair, your armpits, your underclothes. It masked odour and attracted bees. Some chewed herbs to freshen breath. Parsley, fennel, anise. Not because it worked, but because chewing made people feel in control of something. Anything. Civic authorities noticed the problem. In crowded cities where sewage ran through the streets and summer turned every building into a crock pot of human soup, scent became political. Street vendors sold bundles of sweet-smelling plants. Churches burned incense not just for ceremony, but for smell control. During plague outbreaks, physicians wore beaked masks stuffed with herbs. The belief was that disease floated on bad air, so you walked around breathing in time and hoping death would get confused. You're handed a sprig of sage and told to keep it under your tongue. It does not help. Your tongue is now dry and spicy, but you say thank you anyway. People perfume their homes using strewing herbs, plants scattered on floors to release fragrance when stepped on. Chamomile, lemon balm, sweet flag. They did not clean, but they optically cleaned, which was close enough. You walk to the back of the shop. A man is grinding something with a mortar and pestle. You ask what it is. He says nard and goat bile. You ask what it's for. He says intimacy. You leave that section. Personal hygiene kits sometimes included tooth powders with cinnamon or cloves, not to clean, but to disguise decay. You remember the last person who spoke to you. You now understand their aggressive peppermint scent was not accidental. Some nobles perfumed their wigs, others perfumed their horses, some perfumed their curtains so that the room gave off an aura of intentional hygiene, even when everyone inside smelled like foot stew. But scent had meaning. To smell like certain herbs implied piety. Rosemary was for virtue, lavender for cleanliness, musk for masculinity, civet for wealth, frankincense for holiness. If you smelled like all of them at once, people assumed you were either sick or possessed. You exit the stall carrying a small cloth pouch tied with twine. It is stuffed with marjoram, rose petals and a few cloves. It dangles from your belt. It makes you feel important. It makes you feel slightly less offensive. But as the breeze carries a new scent across your path, you realise something deeply unsettling. It is not you. It is everyone else. Because masking your own odour was only half the problem. The other half was navigating a world where personal hygiene stopped at the waist. Because next you are going to step into the one hygiene topic no one wants to discuss. Feet. And why medieval people treated them like mushrooms growing under a leaky roof. You adjust your pouch of herbs and feel slightly more fragrant. Slightly. You take a step, then another, and then you feel it. That slow squish. The warm friction. The damp rubbing of fabric against skin that was not meant to rub. You look down, you lift one foot, and now you remember. You have feet, and in the Middle Ages that was a problem. Because medieval feet were more than functional. They were trapped, mistreated, ignored, and often weeping. You're now about to uncover the terrible truth that lurked beneath nearly every hemline from the 9th to the 15th century. Let us begin with the basics. You're wearing woolen hose. They're itchy. They are warm. They do not breathe. They cling to your calves like moist regret. Your toes are crammed into leather shoes that were crafted by someone who clearly hated feet on a personal level. Medieval shoes came in two general forms: soft leather slippers with little to no sole support, or long pointed poulaines, the fashion equivalent of a nosebleed. The points could be so long they needed to be tied to your knees with string to avoid tripping. This was not satire. This was style. You now understand why no one ran anywhere. These shoes had no arch support, no cushioning, no waterproofing. You walked across cobblestone, mud, snow and manure with nothing but a slice of animal skin between your sole and the plague-soaked earth. As a result, your feet are damp, always damp, and this is where the real trouble begins. Because damp feet become soft feet, and soft feet become split feet, and split feet become infected feet, and infected feet become someone else's problem when they start attracting flies. You pass a man removing his shoes, the air changes, birds fly away, a rat collapses. You do not stare. You respect the bravery. Hygiene rituals for feet varied depending on class, location, and tolerance for pain. The wealthy sometimes bathed their feet in warm water with herbs, bay leaves, chamomile, vinegar. These were called foot baths, and were considered both soothing and necessary after long hours in stiff boots. The poor did not have that luxury. Instead, they removed their shoes once a week, or once a season, or never. Some peasants simply slept in their shoes to prevent theft. Others stuffed straw into the toes for insulation and let it rot in place. Socks, if they existed, were made of wool or linen. They were tube-shaped, no heel, no stretch. They bunched up inside the shoe like warm pudding and held moisture like a sponge in denial. They were rarely washed, often patched, and when they tore you just ignored it and added another layer of dirt to keep the hole sealed. You are now painfully aware that something is festering near your big toe. Blisters were common, so were corns, so were chilblains, painful swellings caused by a repeated exposure to cold, damp conditions. Toenails thickened and curled, fungal infections went untreated for years. There was no foot powder, there were onions. Yes, onions. Some medieval texts recommend applying mashed onion to foot sores. Others suggest crushed garlic, or goose fat, or soaking your feet in stale beer. You're now wondering if feet were food or medicine. The answer is yes. Shoemakers, or cordwainers, tried to help. But most shoes were made to generic sizes. Left and right were optional. Custom fits were rare. And if you had a bunion, you simply accepted it as part of your identity. You stumble slightly. You feel your sock slip. You hear a squelch that shouldn't exist outside of marshland. Removing the shoe is not an option, but curiosity wins. You find a bench, you untie your poulaine, you peel back the woolen hose, your foot is pale, pruned, smells like salted mushroom stored in a root cellar. The skin between your toes is soft enough to spread on bread. You reach for your herb pouch and consider stuffing it between your toes like a medieval foot taco. People did try to fix things. Foot odour was managed with herbs, ashes and dust. Some carried footstones, smooth rocks kept warm by the fire and placed in shoes to dry them. Others simply stuffed dried moss into their shoes and replaced it monthly. It absorbed moisture and gave you a squishy walk that sounded like betrayal. Cracked heels were smeared with tallow, or mashed beans, or cow dung. This last one is historically accurate and emotionally scarring. In monasteries, monks were required to wash the feet of the poor as a spiritual exercise. This meant kneeling, untying shoes, and scrubbing crusty medieval souls in front of God and witnesses. There were blessings involved, and sometimes vomiting. Pilgrims often developed ulcers, not metaphorical ones. Literal, open sores from walking hundreds of miles in shoes made from regret. Some wrapped their feet in cloth, others walked barefoot as penance. The end result was the same. A medieval foot was never neutral. It was always actively deteriorating. And still, people danced. They jumped over fires. They climbed ladders. They marched to battle, all with a quiet knowledge that their toes were slowly dissolving into a medieval fondue. You slide your shoe back on. It does not feel better, but it is contained. You stand. You limp. You pretend nothing happened. But now that you have touched the bottom of the hygiene barrel, you think of something worse. What happened when people got old? Because next, you're going to learn what aging did to hygiene, and why medieval elders often smelled like boiled wool, sour milk and humility. You shuffle along the path, foot dragging slightly from one too many squelches inside your shoe. Your knees ache, your back pops. You take a deep breath and smell yourself. You do not smell good, but you do smell alive, and that puts you one step ahead of the average medieval elder. Because in the Middle Ages, to be old and unwashed was not just common, it was expected. Medieval hygiene was already a fragile system of hope, herbs and creative denial. But the moment you hit about 40, if you lived that long, it all began to fall apart. Not metaphorically, physically. You're now entering a stage of life where bending over becomes a calculated risk, where bathing is not an event, it is a negotiation with the weather, your joints, and whether or not anyone has a bucket. Life expectancy hovered around 35 to 40 years, not because people spontaneously combusted on their 40th birthday, but because so many died in infancy, childhood, and childbirth that the average was dragged down like a peasant in a mud pit. If you survived disease, war, famine, childbirth, tooth abscesses, plague, parasites, and accidental falls into your own latrine, you could live into your 60s, maybe longer. But by then, your hygiene routine was less about cleanliness and more about minimizing collapse. You reach a cottage. An old woman sits by the hearth. Her hair is white. Her hands are swollen. She smells like cooked cabbage, wool grease, and incense ash. She's the cleanest person here. Let us start with the basics. Elders bathed less frequently than the rest of the population, not by choice, but because the physical effort required to heat water, strip down, bathe, and dry off in a stone room with no insulation and an ambient temperature of disappointment was simply too much. Instead, they relied on wipe-downs, a damp cloth to the face, a vinegar rinse on the hands, maybe a foot soak once a month if the weather was generous, and your family remembered to ask how your ankles were doing. Hair was rarely washed. Scalp oils were considered protective. Combing was done with the help of others, since elders often had reduced mobility and shaky hands. Lice were not a pest. They were a companion. Teeth were often gone by this point. Gums became soft. Breath was catastrophic. There was no dental plan. Tooth loss was expected. If you made it past 40 with more than 5 teeth, you were whispered about in awe, a walking miracle, or possibly a heretic. You're handed a cup of something warm. It smells like boiled weeds and possibly turnip broth. You sip it and pretend to enjoy it. The elder beside you wipes her hands on her apron and begins to explain how her knees only pop when the moon is wrong. Old age brought creaking joints, swollen feet, fungal infections, hemorrhoids, chronic back pain, and an overwhelming sense that soap was too slippery to trust. Their clothing reflected their hygiene strategy. Elders wore layers, long linen chemises, woolen tunics, heavy cloaks. Layers insulated, but more importantly they hid everything. Stains, sores, missing limbs, entire families of fleas. You name it. You draped it in wool and called it handled. Elder undergarments were often never changed, or shared among family members, or burned ceremonially when someone finally decided the smell was getting political. Mobility meant hygiene was communal. If an elder needed help washing, the task fell to family members or caretakers. This often meant wiping down a parent with a damp cloth while whispering the Lord's Prayer and trying not to breathe through your nose. Many elders sat for long periods, too long. Bedsore hygiene was not understood. Some were propped up with hay-stuffed cushions, others were rubbed with tallow. If infection set in, it was blamed on demons or sins committed during the plague years. Elder fingernails were rarely trimmed, hands curled in, nails thickened, toes twisted inward. Socks remained stuck to the skin. Entire feet disappeared into wool boots and were not seen again until the funeral. And yet, elders were respected. Their hygiene might have been catastrophic, but their wisdom was priceless. Even if that wisdom mostly consisted of knowing which tree bark could stop diarrhea and which herbs not to rub on your groin. They smelled like life experience, like leather, herbs, fermented onions and chair cushions that had known too many winters. And they told stories. Stories about how things used to be, how they used to bathe once a year whether they needed it or not, how they beat lice with vinegar and solved problems with nettle soup, how the youngest generation had gone soft with their fancy socks and their 2 spoons. You listen, you nod, you scratch your calf and feel a soft squelch. The old woman beside you smiles knowingly, but before you can ask her how she manages to live with 3 layers of wool underwear and a haunted chamber pot, you hear the clanging of bells. Something is happening. Because if there is one place where hygiene completely disintegrated into spectacle, ceremony and collective tolerance, it was the medieval public festival. And somehow, against all odds, you made it. If you enjoyed bathing in historical misery with me tonight, I'd love it if you gave this video a like, maybe even subscribed for more bizarre bedtime history. And if you're curious what happens when these unwashed warriors get drunk and attempt synchronized maypole dancing in a pit of mud and questionable pie crusts, drop a comment below and tell me you want that medieval public festival episode. I'm already clutching my loot and emotionally preparing. In the meantime, go check out one of my other sleep history videos. Trust me, if this was your first one, your hygiene standards are already too far gone. Good night, and may your socks never come alive.